So I'm sure you've all heard about Martin Scorsese's comments about Marvel films. I'm going to look at some of the responses to it, and I want to talk about maybe some ideas of where cinema can go in the future. Stay tuned. So Kevin Smith, I think he has the best argument where he talks about the emotional attachment to the characters. I don't think Martin Scorsese, not to put words in his mouth, was saying that superhero movies cannot be cinematic. I mean, he's not coming down on Birdman. He wasn't coming out on these kind of shows. And I believe, if I'm not correct, I'll have to verify this, that he was involved in the earlier production of, he was involved earlier with the Joker's production. Now, why are movies able to be compared to a theme park ride? Well, because a theme park ride is the easiest way to communicate and experience outside of language barriers. If you're moving a film to China, to India, if you're moving a film overseas where your language is not mainly English and the cultural dynamic is not mainly English, it's less controversial to do something mindlessly entertaining. But this is not new. There's been Hollywood blockbusters for a long time. I think the concern is that there's such a movement towards transmedia tentpoles and franchises now that kind of templating for film is going to become the main basis for how people consume film. And that the classical cinema, which is emotionally probing, it's psychological, there's something more attuned to the zeitgeist as a creative art form that was a dialogue with society. And I guess that's the big difference, is a lot of these Marvel films, they're a confirmation, an enjoyment. I don't know if they really focus on any greater dialogue, and that is likely because of where they're being sold to make up half their margin. If you're trying to keep everyone happy, you're gonna water some stuff out, and that's kind of the state of it. Not to say that with the right direction, these things couldn't be taken in an emotional place. It's just whether that would be tolerated in a Marvel universe. What kind of risk would it take? I mean, look at how Deadpool was taken, not necessarily to a crazy deeper political space, but I would say that it stands out as a superhero movie simply because it was unique. It was a unique experience in cinema. Cut. Okay. I would say that Deadpool itself was more of a subversive film. It was subverting the superhero genre, and so you can argue that was more cinematic because it did have a meta narrative to it, and that narrative did resonate with people, which is why it was such a big movie. The issue is like Return of Jafar. You really have to be careful when working with a franchise, and I think there's a really interesting approach to this problem that I came across the other night at Zoo when I was visiting Montreal. Now, there was so the other night, I met Alexander Aminko, who's the CEO and co-founder of Reflector Entertainment. Who's the CEO? The other night, I met Alexander Amenko. Amencio? Interesting guy. The other night, I met Alexander Amencio. And, wow, that sounds like Ezio. Well, it's funny because he was on Assassin's Creed for a long time. Interesting. Anyways, so he was at Zoo in Montreal, where I was visiting, and he was talking about transmedia storytelling. And now he's developing a very interesting property called Impossible 9, about 9 immortals. I'm really into the immortal stuff. But one of the main things that kind of went on At the event, he went over the Walt Disney 1957 business model. Here's on screen. And this kind of integrated film business model is, the precursor of the modern age of cinema, and really a big point of Disney's success, especially when they started to add acquisitions to it. I mean, this original model was generally tied towards, really towards film creation and not acquisition. So adapting the model to acquisition has really, really, really brought a lot of content into the play to put into this marketing scheme. One of the things you would notice here is between the TV and the theatrical releases, it's meant to provide interchange of stars. And that's an interesting point because that became a point of topic the other night at the zoo. And I'm just going to we'll come back to this, but I want to switch over very quickly to the more streamlined story worlds, which you have live events, TV series, films, video games, mobile games, movies, graphic novels, podcasts, blogs, web, merch, RPGs, anime series, live events. It's one thing this storyboards graphics missing is fashion, because there's a merchandising aspect to it as well that I think is, well, I guess that qualifies as merch, so I'm going to cut that. So merchandising. Cut. So I love the story world simplification of the Walt Disney process, but what I think it kind of loses is there's no consideration of talent and personnel and how that kind of works back and forth. There's a very underdeveloped sense of how to utilize talent for these films and the role that influencers play within our society. Now, there's not a universal use for influencers, without a doubt, but if you cut. Influencers are a mixed bag because it really depends on what kind of community they've built around them. If they don't have an active, engaged community where there's a two-way interaction, where there's real appreciation and affection, not to mention trust, then you can't really partner with products to make it work out. And a lot of times, just because someone is watching a stream because of arousal, basically because it's bikini pictures or other pictures, that doesn't necessarily translate to a lot of products, and it would really depend on the person. So I think you really need to be careful about the influences with which you tie a product. And I think now if you look at celebrities, they are tied with influencers, and I think in the future that's just going to grow more and more. So the manner in which you manage celebrities and influencers is going to be essential, especially with your story worlds, your tentpole projects. And while it's great to have, so because of all these new ways to market a story, and new ways to connect with the audience, and how they all kind of work like a snowball effect, that you can program into basic seasons of different media, which is a very interesting approach. It still runs up against the same problem. The first season, second season, third season. The first season belongs to the producers and the showrunners. Second season, the collaboration between the producers, showrunners, and the actors. Third season belongs to the actors, because now they are those characters, psychologically speaking. And a lot of issues with tentpoles revolves around using the same actor, carrying the series for so long, the increase in value and the ROI that a company gets is they have to pay their actors more and more, or they have to cancel the series and start again. So say someone's looking for a continued world. Disney, it created characters, it created its own world, and it kept kind of employing off that world much in the same way Warner Brothers did, much the same way, I guess Disney's the progenitor of that, but that franchise interconnected story world. I like that concept to an extent, but it goes right back to Martin Scorsese. When you're focusing on story worlds, where's cinema? You can tell a story that would be cinema in a story world, but can you when there is so much on the line for. There's so many interconnected companies. Is it without decoupling story worlds from cinema projects? Does that mean that the dialogue in society suffers? Which I think is the underlying point, is that we get stigmatized for having complexity. And that's a real problem, because I absolutely love story worlds. I love these complex franchises with a lot of different ways to consume the characters. And I would think it would be a huge loss for that to not be there, because it's a really fun, immersive world to enjoy. And you can learn a lot from characters, but in a lot of ways they should be more like modern fables. In the same way that we have like Greek myth with Hercules, there's always kind of a baseline fairy tale-esque fable element to it. There's a moral paradigm at play. And the interesting thing about moral paradigm, there's always with Greek myth, there's always, to my understanding, a moral parable at play. And that's kind of the basis of a lot of Greek storytelling. Now, the issue, I think, is that theme rides don't have a moral parable per se, or that moral parable is quite secondary. And you know what? I think that's one of those things that has been kind of cut down at Marvel. I think that's one of those things that have been lost in Marvel, is that a lot of these characters were all moral parables. And they really taught you something about yourself and how you could act and how you could develop and how you could mature and how your conduct could change. And I think that lack of focus on virtues, superhero virtues, and the virtues of these characters, it has kind of been supplanted secondary. That the conflict itself doesn't feel like it requires so much sacrifice. Like in the last Iron Man, there's kind of a clarity that you're trying to finish off Robert Downey Jr. for the franchise because he's a very expensive an actor. And that goes back again to the story worlds model, which doesn't necessarily take into account long-term relationship with talent and how integral that's going to be for your production. So yeah, I can see Martin Scorsese's point. I think it's because the roots of Marvel and a lot of the earlier films had those very strong moral parables. You really had a character who had to transform something, as opposed to these fully realized characters that are, together for a big party to prevent a big baddie. Really, it even goes down to Thanos not really being that well developed. It's just half. They took. I don't know. I think that's generally writing issues, and a lot of times it depends on the internal structures. I mean, it did well. You can't complain with that, but we're not talking about a movie doing well. We're talking about whether it was cinema and to what extent it should have been. I'm a huge fan of the early Marvels. I love superhero movies because I'm one of those guys who grew up reading comic books. I mean, like everybody, it's not a weird thing now, but I was so excited that there were superhero movies. I enjoy reading them, but I don't see them as a competitor for cinema. But in the box office, they're really, really dominating that space. So, and what is the solution to that? Well, I think it actually comes down to the experience of theater and how that experience of theater, especially with black screens, obviously don't say TVs, computers, laptops, you really need to change how you make theater a social space, because cinema itself is to do with the commons. So a superhero movie does take up the commons, and I'd argue that it should make strong parallel. I'd argue that it should be abstract parables as opposed to a direct, heavy-handed principle. Whenever you have kind of a direct, heavy-handed moral lesson, it becomes preaching. It's not an aha moment that someone kind of comes to understand a perspective or a way to increase their own manners, their own conduct, and their own virtue. It's found information, and you want to make sure that parables and storytelling are always found information, because if they're not found, then they're seen as being pushed down someone's throat. And that's the balance we're at right now. And I think that people aren't really considering that balance as appropriately as they should. And I think that it's a very short-term strategy that's going to be damaging to a lot of brands in the long term. So cinema, it's the reality is that I think it's not cinema, mostly because the parables are a bit heavy-handed, and that's largely to do with trying to communicate an abstraction to foreign audiences. And so what you need is people who are better at the nonverbal communication of abstraction, and that's where cinema comes in. And I think that regardless if you make a simpler movie, a minimalist movie, philosophy, at least in the elements that would confuse foreign audiences, I think you can make all of these superheroes extremely cinematic. And that just comes down to subtle communication. And that's a difficult task. And that's a new generation of filmmakers that need to communicate something beyond the confines of their own language, beyond the confines of their own social culture and experience, and being able to communicate something fundamentally universal. I mean, that's always what I guess the view of Hollywood's been, is there's these universal ideals and emotions connecting to these so that anyone could put themselves in these characters regardless of where they're from. You can also argue that there was some of that American exceptionalism in the movies, and people really like to see that and root for America, right? That's not obviously the case in movies these days, and especially dealing with foreign markets. So, man, I think you can use some tech to fix a lot of the issues with the cinema attendance. I don't think luxury is the way to go. I think that there's different experiences you can employ to really grow cinemas, and I think you're going to need to change some of the promotion strategies of cinemas and motion pictures, and I got some ideas for that, so I'll try and employ that in the next little while in my projects, and I'll let you know how it goes. But Marvel might not be cinema, and that's just because the parables are very heavy-handed and they lack an emotional depth and complexity. And I don't believe that's because it can't be fit into the market space. I believe that's just simply because an aversion to risk. And that aversion to risk generally doesn't make great films. Sometimes there's risk on a film, sometimes it doesn't work out. And without an acceptance of risk, you're never going to make anything great. So, I don't know, I hope that was helpful. But if I'm going to summarize really quickly, there's a Disney model of producing films that has become the norm across industries. It's experiencing some refinement in places like Reflector Media. It's experiencing refinement at places like Reflector Entertainment in Montreal, but I still think there's a ways for that model to go, and I believe that it can keep cinema in its model. I think that cinema itself needs to be part of that model because Martin Scorsese is making a valid criticism. Whether a lot of people are allowed to respond to it by contracts, doesn't matter. There's a point, it can be improved, and it's not a tremendous shift. It's a small, considered, careful shift that just makes film better.